Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to the second lecture in the course Understanding the Old Testament. And today we're going to continue with the syllabus that we have been working on, Understanding the Old Testament. And we gave the video of the last session online, and it was shared in the group. So if any of you would like, you can take a look at that and benefit from that as well. So we covered such topics such as the nature and authority, inspiration of the Bible, how the Bible was formed, how there was oral tradition, written traditions, and then we talked about the Tanakh, the Torah, Nabim, and the Ketubim, which was the three-part division of the Jewish scriptures. And then we talked about manuscripts, translations, and then we talked about how the Old Testament canon was formed. Okay, in other words, how did we get these particular books, and how did they come together as one? What was the process, and what was the history behind that, and what is our understanding regarding that? Okay, so we talked about that. Then we talked about we talked about Palestine and all the different nations or the people groups of ancient West Asia. Then we talked about the patriarchs, their origin, and where did they come from? And then we also talked about the historicity of the patriarchs, the question of did the patriarchs really exist? Now, some people have the doubts about that, but we talked about that as well. Okay, so now we are ready to go to the next step, Israelites' worship and relationship with God. Okay, their worship and their relationship with God. Okay. And so this will be the second segment of our lectures, their worship and the relationship with God. See, the earliest patriarch, Abraham, of the Israelites, they were clearly presented as worshipers. How so? Well, they built altars at significant junctures of their lives, and they worshiped God. In other words, when they moved to a new location, they built altars. When there was specific important events in their life, they would build an altar and they would worship God. Maybe they would sacrifice animals on that altar and pour incense and things like that. That was the time. That was the mode of worship of the people of that time. So these were times of celebration, distress, danger, and even there are other factors also that were reasons for which they worshipped Yahweh. Now, their worship was very similar to the common patterns of the community that they lived in. Okay, the other peoples of the land also, they sacrificed animals, they burned incense, and they poured oil, ghee on altars, and they performed different types of functions like that for worship. Okay, the patriarchs, they also did similar things. This was the form of worship that they also practiced. Okay, all right. For the patriarchs, the worship was the key to their relationship with God. We see them connecting with God through worship all the time. Now, I want to talk about worship at different time periods of the Israelites' history. For example, we talked about the patriarchs and their worship, and then it came to the time of the judges. Okay, you know that there was about 400 years of time period of the judges. Okay, now during the time of the judges, they worship God at various, what was called the high places. Okay, and these were places that were like shrines. Maybe there was an altar, maybe there was some images, maybe there were different things there, and they would worship God there. Now, we might think in a modern sense, why would they ever do something like that? That would be unthinkable. Okay, but see, the people of that time, especially the Canaanites, the people that lived in the land of Canaan, these people, the different nations, they believed that gods were limited to a particular land. Okay, so for example, I'm living in Adur. Okay, so as an example, they would think of a god of Adur. They might think of a god of Pandalam, god of Trivandrum, god of Kochi, or something like that. So they see gods as being localized. So that whenever people travel to different places long distance, they would travel, and when they would get to a new land, they would look and observe all the different shrines that are there, the high places, the little places of worship. Okay, and they would be sure to go there and worship that god. And the reason is they want to honor the god of that land. By the way, I realized that when I've noticed some people here in India as well, there are shrines, small places of worship that are built there. So Hindus have that, different Christian churches have that, Muslims have that. So these are little shrines. And I've noticed some people when they're driving, and as they drive by these places, they would kind of put their hand here or on their chest or something like that. Any kind of a gesture of respect toward that particular shrine. Now, they would do that to all shrines. Okay, that's one thing I noticed. So if that person, they would not just do that to their own religion, but any kind of a shrine that they find, they would do that. So I've always wondered about that, and I've been curious about that. I've never asked any of them, why do you do this? I've never asked that. But when I look at the history of the early patriarchs and the Israelites, you see, these were the earliest places where such things were developed. The earliest forms of worship that were there. And so the Canaanites, since they had this perspective, wherever they travel, they would always stop by any and all of the shrines, and they would worship that god. Okay, so then what about the Israelites? Well, the Israelites, they only believed in one God. They only believed in Yahweh as their God. Okay, but what was happening is as God had just brought them out of their slavery in Egypt, God was kind of working on them to reform them and to develop them and to bring them to a proper perspective. Okay, and we know that these laws were given to them by God. They were taught, but it took generations for them to come to that kind of a proper thinking and that kind of a pattern where they only would worship one God. In the early times, although Yahweh wanted them to do that, they were often quite divided when they would travel, when they saw other shrines in their own area as well. They would naturally be drawn toward these to worship. But then God often warned them not to worship at the high places, warned them not to worship at all these different places. Okay, so the time of the judges was kind of a mixed time in that sense. Now, next, we'll talk about worship and the united monarchy. What is the monarchy? Well, monarchy is the time of the kings. And the early time of the kings, we have David as the king, and also, his son Solomon became king. During that time, we know that David built the temple David wanted to build the temple in Jerusalem, but he established Jerusalem as the capital, and the tabernacle was there, and that was the central place of worship that everyone will come to. Now, David wanted to build the temple, but Yahweh told him, no, you are not to build, your son shall build, because you are a man of blood. And so he said, no, I don't want you to build. So at the time of Solomon, we see that the temple was built. And but even before Solomon, during the time of David, David was very clear in making sure that the people would come to Jerusalem to worship. They would say, bring your sacrifices to Jerusalem and then worship here, worship Yahweh here. And one of the reasons they did that to centralize the worship was to avoid all of the syncretism that was there. And syncretism means the worship of various different gods. Okay, so they wanted them to be as the people of God, they wanted them to worship only Yahweh. Okay, this was what they were trying to do during the time of the monarchy. All right, we know that after the reign of Solomon, his son Rehoboam was to be the next king. But then, of course, it was during that time the kingdom was divided into the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom. So Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, he became the king of the southern kingdom in Judah, and Jeroboam became the king of the northern kingdom. And this was, we would refer to it as the divided monarchy. By the way, the Bible doesn't mention these terms, united monarchy, divided monarchy, or anything like that. We give, or biblical scholars, they give these terms to make it easier to identify the different aspects of their history. So the divided monarchy, what happened is you had one kingdom now split into two kingdoms, okay? One nation divided into two different nations. Now, Jeroboam, he was very sharp. One of the things that he did was this. First, one of the earliest things he did was to establish Samaria as the capital of the northern kingdom, and he built a temple there to replicate the temple in Jerusalem. Why? Well, he specifically said, I want to make sure that the people don't go to Jerusalem to offer their sacrifices, because if they do go to Jerusalem, there's a danger that the hearts of the people will be drawn to Jerusalem and toward the southern kingdom. And again, the hearts of the people would be drawn back to the Davidic monarchy. And so he might even lose his kingdom. So to keep that, he made sure to build the temple there in Samaria. Okay. Now, the only problem with the temple in Samaria was that he appointed people to be priests there that were not part of the Levitical priesthood, that were not the descendants of Aaron and the original priest, and that was the typical way that they would do it. But he began to appoint just about anybody. And then, of course, that caused a major problem in their worship, because their worship became very syncretistic. Okay, that means their worship became something very different from what Yahweh really wanted them to be able to worship God in that way. Okay, so that was the temple in Samaria. And so this was worship during the divided monarchy. And then their worship during the exile and the post-exilic time. And we know that around 580, 583 BC, the people were taken into exile. The northern kingdom was taken by the Assyrians. We'll talk about this later. And the southern kingdom was taken by the Babylonians. Okay, and it was during this time that they began to, so during this time, there was no temple. And so since there was no temple, there were no sacrifices. But they did get together in different places in smaller groups, and they got together and they had prayers, they worshiped Yahweh, they read the Torah, they read the Word of God, and they meditated on God, and they prayed to God in different places. This became synagogues in the future. Later on, the different synagogues, that's where it comes from. Now, you will see that in the first century, in the Gospels, we see that, and the book of Acts, we see the synagogues. We know the temple was still there, but then there were many synagogues where people worshipped Yahweh there as well. All right, so this is the different aspects of the worship of the Israelites that I wanted to point out. All right, we'll go to another thing. Another aspect is this. And another major portion in our syllabus is liberation from Egyptian slavery. Liberation. Now, of course, we were talking about things after the Egyptian slavery, but we were talking about the actual worship of the Israelites. So we'll get to the liberation right now. Liberation from Egyptian slavery. Okay. First of all, the history of slavery. See, history of slavery was quite common throughout the land. Okay, there were slaves from generation to generation, similar to the Israelites. But different nations had slaves, and some of these slaves may be people who sold themselves into slavery, maybe for a particular time period until their debts can be paid off. And so there were different types of slavery. And then there was also people who were captured as a result of war. Okay, they often may be kept as slaves, and so there were various reasons for people becoming slaves, and that was a common thing throughout the world during that time. Now, the Israelites, they were in good standing with Pharaoh to dwell in that land because of Joseph. Okay, when they first had gone into Egypt. But then, of course, what happened is after Joseph died and the new Pharaoh came into power, all of a sudden, this ruler didn't even know Joseph and didn't know what Joseph had done for Egypt and for the world in general, and didn't know the agreement that was there with the previous king and Joseph. Because of that, they began to oppress the people. Now, there were obviously two reasons why they did that. One reason, of course, was that there is fear that this group of people were becoming so large that if there was war between their enemies, this group could rise up and become an internal force that would cause them to lose the war. Okay, that was one reason as well. And the second reason was that very practical reason that they had free labor. Okay, it's possible that the great pyramids of Egypt may have been built by the Israelites and their labor. We don't know, but it could be. Okay, these are all possibilities. But they did all of that through slave labor anyway. All right, so they served Egypt there for 400 years. Now, we also want to look at this idea of God as being a God who identifies with the oppressed. Okay, God is a God who identifies with the oppressed. See, throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Israelite bondage to the Egyptians and their subsequent deliverance, it's presented as a very pivotal point in their history. As a matter of fact, numerous times we see throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament, people, writers, speakers, preachers, when they preached, they said, remember, it was Yahweh who brought you out of the bondage and slavery of Egypt. So that was a very pivotal time for the Israelites in their history. They would always remember that. That's something that they always pointed back to. In their struggle, God identified with the people, with this oppressed group of people. He identified with them to see, to hear, and to respond to their pleas for deliverance. Okay? Their people cried out in their pain. They cried out in their struggle. And we see that God was a God who identified with them. And he basically comes down and he sees their situation and he hears their cry and he responds to bring deliverance to them. So this identification with the oppressed and the subjugated people seems to be a constant pattern in God's dealing with people. He constantly seems to identify with those who are oppressed in various ways by the society. We see that as he deals with the Israelites. He specifically tells them, look, take care of the widows, the orphans, the aliens, those who are travelers from other places, or those who are from other lands. Don't oppress them. Take care of them. Be kind to them, because remember, you were once slaves. Your forefathers were once slaves in Egypt. So he specifically, again, points to that and says, so therefore, you need to behave differently than the common people of the land. Don't oppress them. Be kind to them. Be gentle with them. Okay? So, God identifying with the oppressed. Okay. Another factor we want to look at is the role of women for the liberation of the Hebrews. The role of women. What was the role of women? And we are quite familiar with the story. So the liberation of the Hebrews from Egyptian slavery is quite unique in that several women played prominent roles. Okay, the midwives were some who were bold and stood against the king's orders to kill the male children born to the Hebrews. As a matter of fact, it will be difficult to think of disobeying the order of a king. Why is that? Well, in the modern world, we're not that familiar with kingdoms. Okay, I know that in England, you have a kingdom there, but and you call it the United Kingdom and all that. But the king, I'm not sure how much power he has. It's not, his word is not final there. Okay, it's more of a what do you call that? There's a term for that. It's more of a different type of a role where it's not a legislative role like many of the kingdoms of old days as it was. Okay, all right. So to disobey the king was an unthinkable fact. And to disobey the king would mean death for anyone. That's how it was. And you might remember the story of Esther. Okay, you remember during that time where Esther had called the king and Mordecai together for a banquet or for a dinner, and they were together. And Esther had revealed that Mordecai was the one that was trying to destroy her own people. And of course, the king was upset, and he was upset, and he walked away to the other room. And at that time, Mordecai, began to beg the queen, oh, please have mercy on me, and he began to beg her, actually, and maybe he was real close to her, in maybe kneel down or something, I don't know what, to beg her to have mercy on him. Okay, but at that point, the king walks back into the room, and the king feels that it was inappropriate what he was doing. Okay, maybe he was too close to the queen, maybe in proximity, and so the king says, "Will he even molest the queen?" That's what the English translation says. Now, I'm sure that he might not even touched her. Okay, he might not have even touched her. I'm sure just probably was a little bit too close to her than anybody would ever get to the queen. Okay, you'd always keep a distance. And at that point, when the king said those words, will he even molest the queen? As soon as he said those words, the Bible says that the attendants that were there, they immediately brought some cloth or fabric and put it on top of Mordecai's head and took him away. And often, when do you cover somebody's head and face completely? Well, that's usually when somebody dies, right? One of the first things they do is they cover the dead body once that person is dead. Up to that time, in the hospital, there might be a bed sheet and covering this much, but then soon after that, it's raised, and the face is also covered as soon as the person is dead. So here is Mordecai. He was still alive, and he was still, walking and breathing and everything, but then his head was covered. Why? Because the words of the king, okay, as soon as he said those words, as soon as he spoke those words, Mordecai was as good as dead. Okay? It was as if it was already determined. It covered his head. Forget it. He was to be gone. Okay, so why did I say that story? The reason I said that story is not because I got lost here, but specifically because these women who were midwives, who stood against the king's orders to kill the male children born to the Hebrews, it's amazing. It's unthinkable that they would do such a thing. Okay, I am sure God's involvement was there very clearly. Otherwise, normal human beings will not have that type of a boldness. Okay, I'm sure God must have given them such kind of a boldness to do that. And then another person was Moses' mother, who took the initiative to hide that newborn child to try to save his life. And I think it was 3 months they tried to do that. It's tough to keep a baby hidden in your own home for 3 months. That's tough to do. The baby's going, you're going to hear the baby crying, and the noise will be there. And then the next person will be Miriam, the sister of Moses, who was bold enough to follow the baby and to even suggest to get a nurse for the baby. And the nurse ended up being the mother of the child itself. Okay. And then another another woman that was part of this God's great plan was the daughter of Pharaoh, who felt compassion and decided to raise the child as her own, even though it was a Hebrew child, even though it was a slave child. Okay, she recognized it as a slave child as well. And such things would be unthinkable there. But we can see the hand of God in all of this. But we see clearly that God used several women for the liberation of the Hebrews. Very significant for our understanding. Okay. Now, as I'm going through each one of these, if you have questions, make sure you make note of that. And then, I'll take a break in about another maybe 10 minutes. And then we'll give you a chance to ask any questions. Then we'll continue. All right. Another item we'll talk about is Moses, his life, his calling, leadership, success, and some failures. See, in the great or the grand scheme of the history of the Israelites, Moses plays a prominent role. See, the biblical narrative is structured in a systematic manner, as if it was a well-structured and staged play with insignificant characters playing a major role, with characters that are insignificant, but they end up playing a major role. Thus, we see Moses' life, his calling, his leadership, his success, and his failures are all presented as playing the pivotal role in the liberation of this large group of slaves from Egypt. Okay, so this is quite significant because we see that all of these factors are organized in such a way that it is almost too good to be true. Okay, it was the underdog coming out as the winner, or the people that are unheard of, or the people that didn't have a voice. All of a sudden, they come into leadership and they're able to do great things for God. Okay, these are almost unthinkable, but this very reason actually trips up a lot of people. So people begin to say that, oh, you know what? This story seems too good to be true. So therefore, it must be too good to be true. Therefore, there are people who actually feel that none of these stories are accurate and that these are all fake. Okay? All right. Now, but you also have to understand that no nation ever wants to give their negatives. The Israelites were unique in that. Okay, so some people say that Egyptian history doesn't seem to show the Israelite slavery and their subsequent escape the way that they did. Okay, and so that's a significant question and accusation. But we need to understand that most of the nations of that time, and maybe even today, when they record their history looks very nice. Okay, the negatives of their history may not even be mentioned, or they will take the negative aspects of their history and kind of whitewash it or make it look good, and kind of give it a different perspective. And this is very common in those days, and maybe even today it's common where nations will maybe even rewrite their history to a point where they look better than they ever were. Okay, this was a similar case with the Israelites as well. So Moses' life, his calling, his leadership, and his success and his failures, all of these are aspects that we need to understand that are part of the deliverance of the people. Okay, so I'm going to stop here for a minute and give you an opportunity to ask any questions you have.
Yes, sir. So I wanted to.
Yeah.
One second. So first question. The midwives you were mentioning about midwives going against the word of the king.
Yes.
That and as you rightly mentioned, that's not a usual thing.
Yeah.
What other than the hand of God, do you think something else might have played there for a community of midwives to take an action the against the king's word, where the midwives Israelites? Is
Okay.
what would that be one of the reasons?
Yeah. Um, you know what? I don't know that. I have to look at their names and see if they were, and most probably they were Israelites. Okay. That's a possibility. But even then, the same factor is there. Okay. They would be, uh, they would lose their neck. And normally people would not want to do that. So that would be a motivation, right, for them to save their own people. But then, what's the benefit if you save your people but you lose your neck? And most of the time, people don't do that. It's like Jesus, he died for us and he gave us his life, right? But the best we can do for somebody is to give a donation. All right. We might give a donation, but I might give a donation, but I'm not going to put my neck out there to die for somebody. Okay. That's a common human nature. And that's the situation that I would say that, yeah, even if they were Hebrew women, still, this was the situation. Yeah.
Mhm.
That still is very unusual that they would even do such a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
You were also mentioning about the synagogue, the Israelites worshipping in synagogues when the temple was not there. Can you please tell me how the worship in synagogues looked like? Is it similar to the ones in
Yeah.
the temple?
Yeah. So actually, uh, the the book of Psalms is often called the hymn book of the Second Temple period. The hymn book of the Second Temple period. They sang these psalms. These psalms were their hymn book, their song book. And so they sang. And they also read the stories of their forefathers. Okay. They read that to the people. Now, something else that happened is this: during the exile, that was 70 years. Jobin, you have children?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. So children, specifically for Malayalis, I would say, or for any nationality for that matter, if you go to a different country and live there, and after a few years you have children, and your children grow up in that land, automatically
Yeah.
they may know your mother language, mother tongue, but their understanding of that will be much less than if they were to grow up here in your own land. And that was the case with the Israelites as well. You have to understand that 70 years. So within 10 to 20 years that they just arrived in Babylon, the people would have the younger generation that were born there, they are coming up with a different language, different culture, different perspective. So the synagogues, what they began to do was they began to read the text of the Torah, and they would explain the Torah to the people in a different language so that the people can understand, so that the younger people can understand. They don't want to lose the next generation. And so they sang, hymns, which was the Psalms, and they sang. And along with the singing, they would read the Torah, and then they would give explanation to the Torah. Okay, which there we actually have written commentaries on the Torah, commentaries on different books of the Old Testament, and some people they have called it the oral Torah. In other words, that was the Torah being explained to the people in a simpler manner, in a simpler language, so the next generation can pick it up. Okay, and they pray to Yahweh. So these were different functions that they did during the time of the exile and in the synagogues. And remember, one of the major significant factor or time was the reading of the Torah. Okay, and the reading of the Torah was very significant. The reason for that, well, today, each one of us, each one of you in this class, you may have, let me say it this way: you do have your own copy of the Bible, but you may have multiple copies. You may have different translations. You may have different languages. Yeah, you may have some. In some homes you will have maybe 5 to 10 different Bibles there, or even more, and it's not an issue. But in those days, the Torah would take up the entire Old Testament would take up an entire shelf. Okay, because each of the books would be one roll of paper. Okay, so it would be like a scroll. And would be very large. The papyrus that they wrote on, and we talked about it, I think, in the last class, the papyrus that they wrote on was quite thick. And since it was thick, and it would be very large and heavy. So each book would be in a separate scroll. And to reproduce that would be very expensive. So the average person would not have a copy of the Torah, and each synagogue might have their own copy. Okay, so this is a kind of a description about the synagogues.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the Jeroboam, and when they made the temple in Samaria, and the worship, they were not worshipping the way the God wanted. So you used a specific term. Their worship became very syncretistic.
Syncretistic. Syncretistic. Meaning they
just wanted that term.
Yeah, that means they got synchronized with various religions, synchronized with the local Canaanite religions, things like that. Yeah. They adopted practices that were of the Canaanites and brought that as part of their worship. Yeah. Which is something that Yahweh had specifically told them not to do that. Don't take on the practices of the other nations. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Good questions. Let's continue then. And we have another 10 minutes left. All right. So the occupation and the settlement in Palestine. Okay, this is another major portion of our syllabus, the occupation and settlement in Palestine. Now, the different concepts are there regarding this settlement. Okay, one is the conquest model. Number two, there's a peaceful infiltration model. Number three, there's a peasant revolt model. Let me repeat that. Conquest, peaceful infiltration. Third, peasant revolt. Okay, let me explain what these are. You see, the Bible, if you read the biblical account, you'll see that Joshua comes into the new land, and one by one, the nations are taken over. Okay, and only in few places where they've had difficulty, most of the places they were able to go through and take over the land. They literally went in and conquered the land. Okay. Now, some people, when they read the Bible, they have a hard time believing that. They would say, come on, how do you do that? How do you have a group of slaves coming out of 400 years of slavery? See, you got to understand, how is it possible that a group of slaves coming out of 400 years of slavery, all they knew, generation after generation after generation, was slavery? How do a group of people like this, after 400 years, and after all of that, to come in and to just take over this land? They would say, impossible. Okay. Not only that, they just came out of 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And then they come into this land and then just, conquer the land. These are people that are settled in their own land. Just for them to come in like that, they would say it's impossible. Okay, that would have to be a kind of a glorified history of their past. Okay, it would be a glorified. So that's the claim that some scholars say. They have trouble believing that. So they came up with different models. One model, they came up with a peaceful infiltration model. That means they came into this land peacefully, and they lived in the among the Canaanite people, and gradually they infiltrated the land. They grew larger, they grew bigger, and finally, slowly, gradually, they took over the land. Okay, and they subjugated the other people, and the other people became less significant because their numbers grew so much and they became very powerful. That is the peaceful infiltration model. The third one is the peasant revolt model. Okay, the peasant revolt model. This is often referred to by a scholar by the name of Norman Gottwald. Well, he's very famous for this, the peasant revolt. So what he's saying is that the Israelites came in and they peacefully infiltrated the land and they lived among the people, but the working class of the Canaanites, okay, they were very upset with the ruling class, and there was a kind of an animosity between them, and the working class kind of revolted against the ruling class. And when they revolted, the Israelites also joined with them in the revolt, and they helped to fight, and they helped these peasants to win this struggle, or this kind of a civil war that was taking place. And the Israelites helped in that process. And so gradually the Israelites came into power because these were just peasants anyway. The Israelites were sharper, and so gradually they came into power. These are three most common models that are available: the conquest model, peaceful infiltration model, and the peasant revolt model. Okay. Now, the peaceful infiltration and the peasant revolt, when scholars are saying this, there's not sufficient biblical evidence there. They're taking bits and pieces that are there, and they're saying, look, see this? There's an evidence of that. Here, there's an evidence of that. All of this comes because there is a vast amount of distrust, okay, for the Bible and for the Word of God. Now, all of these scholars who come up with these models, who come up with these different concepts, they're all European scholars. They're all Westerners. You have to understand that the Western mind cannot accept the supernatural things. So you have this group of people coming in and coming out of Egypt, and all of a sudden, the Red Sea parted, and the Israelites walked on dry ground. Or the numerous miracles that took place during the time that they were in the wilderness. Or when they were crossing the Jordan, again, the river parted, and they walked on dry ground. So they're like, this is not possible. Okay, they say, well, if we cannot reproduce it, we don't believe it. If we don't see it as commonly before our eyes, we cannot believe it. So this became a big problem for the Westerners, because the Bible, you have to understand, is an Eastern book. And so Westerners, when they read the Bible, they struggled with this concept, and they said, this is not possible. This is like fairy tales. This is like, cooked up stories. You just go there and take a stick and go like this to the water, and then the river just parts like that. They would say, well, if I could do it, if somebody could do it today and show it, then I'll believe it. And so there's a anti-supernaturalistic perspective that is there in the minds of the people that makes it difficult for them to believe any of this. Okay, so therefore they end up coming up with different types of theories of what really would have happened, and that what the Bible shows us is not really what happened. It's just kind of the imagination of future generations. Okay, the future generations are imagining wonderful things about their forefathers, and so therefore they came up with wonderful stories. All right. And so that's the different models on the settlement. All right, next we'll talk about structure of tribal society in Israel. The structures of tribal society in Israel. Of course, Israel, we know that they were divided into 12 tribes, but each of these tribes had very distinctive groupings within the tribes. All right. So each tribe, there would be distinctive groupings like clans and families. All right. The smallest unit would be the family. But when we say family, we cannot think. Yeah, when we talk about families, we cannot think of the modern concept of the nuclear family. That was never existed there. It was always, the more extended family that was there, and then of course, several families together like that would have a clan. Often, that clan would have one, most probably the oldest person, the wisest person, who would be the clan leader. And then, of course, many, many clans together make up that tribe. So you have the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Naphtali, and different tribes. That was how the Israelite society was structured, in tribes, clans, and families. Okay, so it was a very close-knit society, and it was all very clearly connected. And you can see the numerous genealogies that are there in the Old Testament, and it also shows up in the New Testament. These genealogies clearly present to us the fact that their society was not just a large group of people, that just came together, not like that, but they kept very minute, detailed records of their descendants and their families, their clans, their tribes. All of the details were kept. And what we have in the Bible would be the most prominent people. That's it. Not everybody, but they literally had taken census and kept a very clear idea of their tribal society. Okay? All right. One more thing. The social, political, and religious life during the period of the judges. I mentioned a little bit about the judges, right? But what was so unique is that the society was so divided. And the famous statement in the book of Judges about that time period, it says that in those days, there was no king, and every man did as they saw fit. It was like anarchy. It was like a group of people who everybody did whatever they want. And it was, and Americans often call it the wild, wild west. And that's how it was for them. Now, why was it like that? One of the reasons may be that you have to understand this group of people coming out of 400 years of slavery. They were treated definitely as less than human. They were not given the respect as human beings would be shown today. It was not the case. Once you're a slave, you are a property. So if I have a certain thing that, that are like this key, okay, and I say, well, this is my property. Well, I can do whatever I want. I can throw it in the fire. I can bury it. I can throw it out the window. Whatever I do, nobody is there to question me what I do with this little item because I own it. It's mine. It's my possession. It's my right. So in those days, slavery was like that. They were the possession of their masters. And there were no questions asked. So they were treated as property. They were treated as something subhuman. So taking a group of people like this, generation after generation, this is not like, somebody experienced this for, one day or 1 year or something like this. This is 400 years, generation after generation. So this kind of a thinking got entrenched into their mindset. All right, now God sends Moses, delivers them, brings them out, and then God takes them through 40 years in the desert. Okay, and all the turmoil that took place during that time as well. Then they're brought into this new land. How? A land flowing with milk and honey. What does that mean? A very prosperous land. And they were stepping into cities that they didn't build, orchards and vineyards and all the plantations and everything that they never built. Free. Everything was just given to them. And we know those who, we know that when people get something for nothing, when people get something without working for it, they have a unrealistic perspective regarding what they have. Or I should say, unrealistic perspective regarding life itself. And so when we talk about the social, political, and religious life during the period of the judges, we have to understand their background and where they're coming from. So in this situation, during that 400 years of the time of the judges, they were learning how to live together as neighbors. How do you live together as societies? How do you worship God? And how do you relate with God? And how do you relate with each other? How do you make decisions? Before that, there was no such thing as making decisions. You were just beaten by your masters, and whatever they said, you just did. That's all they knew. All of a sudden, now they're coming to their own land. Now they're free. Now somebody has to make decisions. Nobody's there to beat them and to bring them into order. Now they have to. You're getting into self-legislation, self-leadership, self-everything. And that was probably some of the struggles that they were having. So their society, the social aspects were completely their struggle. The political aspects, they were struggling with that. Okay? Religiously, they wavered back and forth from God, Yahweh, to other nations, back and forth. This was the struggle that they had. Okay, but something else during that time we need to understand, as when you talk about the political aspect of that time, was that there were what was called the raiding bands. In other words, group of people who would raid different countries and attack different people and take their cattle, their wealth, their people as slaves, and this was very common. So they had several of their neighbors that were enemies. They would come in and to raid their land, take things from them, and even put fire to their cultivation, and so that these people would literally starve to death because they would have nothing to eat in the next season. And so whatever they had from the previous harvest, that's all they would eat. And after that, they're ready to die. They would be like famine and they would have nothing. So, these kinds of things that were there. Externally, there were problems like this from other nations and the surrounding, raiding bands that would come and attack them, and also internally they also struggled to live together. Religiously, also their devotion to Yahweh was not, was not stabilized. Okay, and this was a time where God was working with them to stabilize them in all of these areas. So these are the social, the political, and the religious life during the time of the judges. Okay. All right, maybe we can stop here, and then I want to give you just a last opportunity to ask questions, and then we can, we can go on. We can look toward the next month, our class next month. Okay, so let me know what might be any doubts, any questions that you have.
Just one question, sir. So,
Sure.
you were mentioning about the Israelites keeping records of their genealogies and several kinds of records.
Yeah.
Especially after they came back from their from Babylon. Who were the ones who were keeping the records? Was it still scribes, or before there were scribes who were probably keeping records?
Okay. See, during that time, not everyone would be educated and be able to read and write. And the best that we can understand that would people that would be able to do that would be maybe tribal leaders, maybe even clan leaders. That's the best we can understand. We have so much detailed records. Now, who actually wrote them, we don't know. But the best understanding would be people that were clan leaders or tribal leaders. They were the best possibilities of keeping records. Yeah. Now, of course, there are people who believe that the Israelites kept no records whatsoever. Okay, all of the things that we have right now in the scriptures, there are people that believe that it was all just a cooked up stories. Yeah. Okay. All right.
And the conquest model, is the is whatever we read in the Bible, right?
Exactly. Yes. The story that we have in the Bible, that is the conquest model. And
why?
Yes. Why?
No, so that's a different question. So why did you say Bible is an Eastern book?
Okay. Why do I say that the Bible is an Eastern book? Okay. Because the stories are all the stories or the events are all things that happened in the East, not in the Western nations. And the writing took place in the East, not in the Western nation. That's why we call that as the ancient Near East. Or we might even call it the Middle East, right? These are terminologies that we have always used, Middle East and the ancient Near East. Very significant. Yeah. And so that's the reason. So the Bible definitely is an Eastern book. So therefore, it is written from an Eastern perspective. So let me give you just one example. If you were to go to one of the villages of North India and go to a place where people don't know Jesus at all, and if you walk down to one of the villages and just walk and find someone and say, hey, I heard about a man who walks on water. Well, what would they say? Most probably they would probably say, who is he? Where is he? I'd like to go and see him do his tricks or do what he does. Now, if you do something like that in England, you walk down the street and find somebody and say, hey, I heard there was a man who walks on water. And they would say, oh, I've got some jokes to tell you too. Come on, let's have a seat and we'll share some good jokes. That's what they would say. And same thing in, most Western nations, people just laugh at you, or they would say, "Yeah, that's some crazy old story. You actually believe that?" They would ask you, "You actually believe that? Are you foolish enough to believe that?" Why? Because there's a Western mindset, and the Western mindset cannot accept the supernatural. Okay, so that all stems back to the history of the Enlightenment, the time of the Enlightenment. Okay, where knowledge and understanding began to rise, and what was called rationalistic thinking became very prominent. And you also call the scientific method. What is the scientific method? Well, you evaluate something with the five senses. Can I hear it? Can I see it? Can I taste it? Can I touch it? Can I smell it? If it can be known through the five senses, then I'll believe it. If it cannot, come on, it's just a story. All right. So that's why I'm calling the Bible as an Eastern book. And the scholars who were evaluating that, they were all Westerners. They were all European scholars, mostly German, yeah, and French, Italian, and others. And of course, more recently, United States. Okay? Yes.
One, in regards with this, so when probably would so was there a Western society um, present during the biblical times, or is that community later developed because of migration?
No. See, those societies were there.
Where there?
Further north, they were there. Like, for example, Paul, he goes to these places, Italia and all these places. These are all, these are what we know today as the Western nations. Okay. But then it was, hundreds of years later that the Enlightenment took place, the rationalistic thinking, all of that developed. And so their frame of reference changed, the way they think about life and society changed. And it was after that they began to study the scriptures, and these theologians began to write about that. And they said, walk on water? Come on. Or, make the river, part into two and make the people walk on dry land. It would say impossible. Yeah. Good. Thank you, Jobin. Good questions. And I will add this recording to the upload this later on to YouTube, and I'll share it with the rest of the class. Good. And then maybe in the class we can discuss, in the group we can discuss when we can meet in the next month in June. All right. God bless you.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye now.
Thank you. You have a good day.